Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and to my studio for this little real-time, full-length demo in Soft Pastel. Today I'm going to share something nice and warming for winter time with a little bit of a festive theme. We're going to work on this lovely little glowing lantern. This full demo is just over 2 hours in length, perfect if you want something nice and short to work along with me. And this is just as a big thank you to all of you who support me here on YouTube. Every once in a while, I try to get a little bit of spare time to make one of these full-length demos just for you guys here. But if you do enjoy this, then please do come and check me out over on Patreon, where you'll find my full library of real-time demonstrations and lots more. But in the meantime, if you enjoy this here, then please, as always, do remember to hit subscribe. So this is what we're going to be working on. I have done this on the Canson Velvet black paper and it's 8 by 10 inches. Now if you don't have this exact paper, I would still recommend a dark coloured paper if you can. There are other brands you could use like the UArt dark grey colour, or even Pastel Mat comes in an anthracite colour. So anything that's dark in colour is ideal for this demo. Here on screen now I'll share the colour list with you. I'm using mostly Unison pastels and a few Terry Ludwigs and just 2 pastel pencils, a black and a brown. If you don't have these exact colours or brands, don't worry, you can absolutely substitute for whatever you have that's close. Now, if you would like access to the downloadable colour list and the photo reference for this demo, I'll add a link in the description below. These will be available over on my Patreon channel. You don't have to sign up. They will be an open post available for everyone to download. So links in the description below for the colour list and the photo reference. But apart from that, I think we are ready to make a start. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how I sketched this one out and got my outline transferred onto the pastel paper. So let's make a start. As always, I'm starting with some plain white drawing paper. Sometimes the thinner the paper, the better it is actually for transferring it onto my pastel paper later on. And you'll see that I do make use of a ruler in this sketch because it's quite a man-made item with a lot of straight lines, a lot of angles, and we're quite close up to the lantern, so we're getting a kind of perspective of looking up at something. So sometimes when I'm drawing something out, I will measure a few areas to get me going. So for example, with this one, I measured how far up from the bottom of the sheet I wanted the lantern to start, and I gave myself that. I also measured how far down from the top of the painting I wanted the very tip of the lantern to be. So I'll give myself a few little measurements before starting. And you can also see that I have a pencil outline, a box that I'm working within that is the size that I want my painting to be. And that is, it's almost like using just one square of the grid method. As quite often I'm actually looking at the negative space, so the space surrounding the lantern, how far it is out to the edge of the paper or my box that I've given myself. And that helps me a lot actually. I'll always give myself that outer box to work within. And as I said, it's a little bit like when you're working with the grid, only in this case it's just one square of the grid. But it's incredibly helpful just to be able to look at the negative spaces as well as the distances and the spaces on the item that you're actually drawing. So quite often, if I am going to paint something that has a lot of straight lines, like even if it's an animal portrait, but there's a windowsill behind them or a door or just something that has straight lines, often in this part of the process, I will use a ruler. I won't use the ruler later on when I'm painting, but just having my initial sketch done with a ruler gives me nice exact lines to follow later on. Even when I'm transferring this image onto my pastel paper, I probably won't use the ruler at that stage, but I've got these good lines to follow during this part of the process. And you can see that I basically just work my way from the bigger shapes down to the smaller details. So I've started with the overall shape of the lantern. And once I get that, then I can start to add some of the inner lines of the little windows, the hinges, the latch, all of the little extra details. But I don't start with those, of course. I start with the bigger overall shapes, and only when I'm sure of those do I start adding more details. And that's also a little bit like how I approach the painting process too. So it will be the bigger shapes, the bigger areas, and working my way down towards smaller details. So one part that I found quite tricky were these little ornate cutout areas in the metal. And of course, with a glowing lantern, that's one of the things that makes the light so beautiful that comes out of the lantern, because it shines out of all of these little holes, creates different patterns on the surfaces nearby. But it was certainly a bit of a head scratcher to sketch those areas out. And again, I look at the negative spaces around the shapes. I start with the bigger shapes and work my way down to the little details. You can see here I'm just giving myself a rough marker of where I want this section to start and where it's going to come down to at the bottom. I'm looking at the bigger shapes first of all, get those placed, and then start to fill in the gaps with the little details. And that's pretty much how I sketch anything. It's a similar way of thinking. Even when it's an animal portrait, I'm looking at the bigger shapes. With portraits, I will quite often make use of a full grid. If it's a commissioned piece of work where I'm trying to get a very exact likeness, I'll often make use of more grid lines just to help with my accuracy. And then if I'm painting wildlife or still life like this, even with landscapes, I tend to go at those usually freehand, but always with this outer box that is the right dimensions of the painting that I want to create. But I do enjoy this part of the process. If I want to get it done more quickly, a grid usually helps me do that. But I do enjoy sketching and freehanding things as well. Now, there are many different ways to get your outline on the paper. You can trace, you can use a projector. There is no right or wrong, and although some ways are better for your artistic practice, I will repeat, there is no right or wrong. However you want to get yourself to the painting stages here, go for it. Now, of course, having a good eye for drawing things out definitely does feed into your painting process. But I hope that the main thing you get from this demo is to have fun. Let's create something really glowing and warm. So here I am just transferring that sketch by putting some pigment on the back of the drawing, taping that over my pastel paper, and then transferring it on. And you can see on the black paper, the outline comes out pretty strong. So we're finally at the painting part of this demo. And from this point on, we'll be in real time, everything moving at a more relaxed pace. I just wanted to include a little bit of the sketching process for this one because I know I don't always include that part of my process. I prefer to just teach about the colour work, about the actual pastel process. And I'm not the most knowledgeable or skillful sketcher. I use grids. I take my time when I'm sketching things. I'm often quite slow at that part of the process. So that's not the part that I usually want to teach you about, but I hope that it's interesting to you to see a little bit of that process. But now we're into the part that I really adore, and that is the colour work. So it's mostly unison pastels that I'm using. I've got a few Terry Ludwigs included here as well, but if you're working along and you don't have these exact brands or these exact colours, please don't worry, you can absolutely substitute for different brands, slightly different colours. The main thing you're going to want to do is try to substitute for other colours that are similar, and especially colours that are similar in tonal value. And what I mean by that is how light or dark the colour is. That's what's most important at getting you to a similar finish as me. But we're going to have a lot of fun with vibrant oranges and yellows. And I hope that you've got some selection of those colours especially in order to capture the glowing inside of the lantern. But I start off with a little bit of background work. I intended to not do very much to the background. My main focus here is on the little lantern. If I were to spend a bit longer on this, I could absolutely render the texture of the stone, add a little bit more texture to the background. But I decided for the purposes of this demo, which you will see as we progress, that I wasn't going to go into a super amount of detail for the background. I just wanted to give a sense of the ledge that the lantern is sitting on and the fact that it's kind of coming out over the front of the ledge. And that's what I'm working on here. So good dark shadow on the front facing surface of this ledge just to give it a 3D kind of effect. And that seems to be an old master's trick for still life. The amount of still life paintings in museums where the object that they're painting, or one of the objects at least, really seems to protrude out of the painting towards us. And it's a really cool trick actually to have one of your items overlapping the surface that they're sitting on. That always seems to be the case in the old masters' still lifes. So here's a paper coming off one of my unison pastel sticks. And I'm just creating a little bit of light and shade here to the right of the lantern. We get very dark shadow down at the front of the painting. And then this sort of ray of light coming up the wall here. So this is Unison NE1. I'm going to shout out a few of the colours as we go along, just so that you know what I'm using. I picked up BE6, also from Unison, for the dark, warm brown right around the lantern. So for the purposes of this shorter demo here on YouTube, I didn't do my normal colour coding. So if you access any of the tutorials on my Patreon channel, a large number of those have the actual color codes popping up in a corner so that you can always see what pastel I'm holding, what color I'm using, the exact code name and the brand. And I do that because, as you'll see in this demo, the pastel sticks, well, some of them are very small and it's hard to see them at all. And then others, well, they get dirtied by my very dirty fingertips as we progress. And it does get harder and harder to see exactly what colour I'm using. For the black, I'm using a new pastel stick. Now these have recently become quite difficult to buy individually. So don't worry if you can't get this particular brand. There are a lot of other hard sticks on the market. And I really only make use of the black when it comes to harder pastels. I just find it quite good to put this darkest, sometimes dirtiest pigment, especially if you're working on lighter colours, next to it. And it produces just a little bit less mess and dust when you use a harder pastel. So that's why I often will use the hard pastel in black. And I'm going to use a good amount of black in this one because I want the background especially to be super dark in around the lantern. So I'm not afraid to use pure black in my work. I know some artists stay well clear of pure white and pure black. I'm always happy to make use of either of them, but only when it's really necessary, especially when it comes to pure white. Whereas pure black to me is really lovely for creating a lot of dark contrast and a bit of drama. And that's what I want with this. I want that background to be really dark and contrasting the brightness of the little lantern. So I'm not going to spend too long on the background for now. You can see that I've got some fern leaves just lightly sketched out in the bottom left corner. And I won't even bother with those right now. I'm just getting a little bit of colour or dark contrast mostly in around the lantern. And then I'm going to get on to the lantern itself, as you can see here. So this is one of the dark green Terry Ludwigs that I'm using in this piece. And it's G620. And you'll see all of these colours that I'm using if you download the colour list to go along with this. And then you can just keep an eye on the colours that I'm using, and I'll try and shout out some of the code names as I go just to keep you right. So at this point I wasn't really 100% sure how dark I would need to go on the white parts of the lantern, on the outside of the lantern, because of course it's not going to be white. If you compare the bright yellows and oranges from inside the lantern, the actual structure on the outside is pretty dark. So the lantern looks much, much different in this kind of lighting and when it's actually lit with candlelight on the inside to how it looks in daylight. And that was part of the fun of this little painting, figuring out what colours to use for the metal structural parts of the lantern on the outside. And for that I actually used a lot of this Terry Ludwig colour. This is N030. Now if you don't have any Terry Ludwigs, you could substitute for some other colours, so just go for darker browns. I've used a dark green and that Terry Ludwig kind of dark, warm, almost like a purple brown. But the main thing here is if you're substituting for other colours, the main thing to do is to try and get the tonal value close. So how light or dark it needs to be. That's the most important part. There's a bit of room for artistic license beyond that. And you'll still get a very similar effect if you just manage to choose similar tonal values. So the orange tone there was BE12 because of course on some of the surfaces of the lantern we're going to get some light spilling out of the inside of the lantern, and that little ledge there that's facing upwards at the base of the lantern, that is glowing a little bit orange, isn't it, in the reference? So I'm starting at the base of the lantern just to try and figure out a few of my colour choices. At this point I'm still not quite sure what colours I need to use. So there's a little bit of figuring out involved in the first steps. But the main thing that I figured would be helpful was to get some of the brighter colours in. So once we do a little bit of work on this base, then I'll switch to the inside of the lantern where we get all of the lovely vibrant yellows and oranges. Once I get a few of those placed, I feel like it'll be easier to see those darker values. Because with the outside of the lantern, I'm still not 100% sure how dark I need to go. But I am more certain of the colours that I need to use on the inside of the lantern, so I can see those quite clearly. The lovely vibrant oranges and yellows. So it makes sense to get some of those in place and then judge those darker values a bit later. It also makes sense to get some of the inside of the lantern done, just from a logistical point of view. You can see with my chunky sticks, it's not going to be easy to work within all of these fine little outlines that I've given myself. So it's best to work what's inside the lantern first, and then it'll be nice to go over the top of all that with my darker lines. So it's kind of like working from background to foreground. The background being what's inside the lantern, what's further away. And then physically what is in front of that are the front panels of the lantern, the outside parts of the metal that are darker. So for now, I focus a little bit on the inside of the lantern. And we can see through some of the little windows to the windows on the back panels of the lantern. So interesting creating something hexagonal like this, and especially something that the light pours right through and you can see out the other side of it. So I'm not too concerned if I am going over the lines a little bit. I don't mind if I cover over my sketch lines a little. I can still faintly see them, so it's fine. I can still see where I need to place the pigment. And I've got the straight ruled lines to follow from earlier, but now at this stage I'm not too concerned if they stay perfect. Now the more perfect you want it, the more I would suggest picking up pastel pencil along the way. And you'll see that I do use pastel pencil to neaten things a bit later on. But at this stage, I'm quite happy to just get some soft pigment on the paper, not be too concerned about the straightness or the neatness of my lines. I'll do my best with that, and you can see that I'm using some smaller pieces of pastel, which helps me to get a little bit more accuracy. But just look at how brightly that orange colour already starts to shine out from the darkness of everything else. So this is yellow 14. Quite an orange type of yellow. I made use of quite a few different yellows and yellow-orange tones in this. And they all have their place because, as you can see on the inside of the lantern, the brighter colours tend to be down closest to the candlelight, and then up around the inside top part of the lantern gets a little bit more orange tone as we get further away from the actual flame. So there's a lovely bit of variation in the bright colours inside the lantern. So just really taking my time with the marks, trying to keep my hand as steady as possible and make all of the lines as accurately as I can. But as I said, it's not vital that everything looks perfect at this stage. It can look a little bit rough. It can look like it needs neatened up a little bit. That's absolutely fine. So don't stress if you're not staying within the lines. It's not important at this stage. Just try to get some of these colours in vaguely the right places. And there's a lot that you can do later on to neaten all of this up, some of which will be with pastel pencil, as you'll see. So I'm just trying to get that inner framework that we can see out the back of the lantern, really. So we're looking through the front window here, and you can see the structure at the back of the lantern. And of course these are shining bright orange yellow because of the glow inside the lantern. Technically, these parts of metal that I'm making bright orange are the same colour as the rest of the lantern, so it's such a huge contrast between the inside metal that's glowing like this and the outside metal that looks much, much darker. And of course, all of it at the end of the day is a white coloured metal lantern. I love painting white things, especially. It's really just a mirror for whatever the lighting is doing. So I've got BE12 again, a slightly darker orange tone. More of a brown orange. And again, we've got a lip, a little ledge outside of the lantern there that is catching some orange light. So I'm really just following the glowing light around at this point. And I'll deal with the outside structure of the lantern later on. And this is where the dark paper really helps. I hope that if you've chosen to work along, that you have found yourself a nice dark piece of paper, whether it's a dark grey or a pretty dark black color like this. Definitely adds to the effect. If you don't have a dark or black colored paper, you could absolutely work on a lighter color of paper. You'll just end up using more black pastel to darken the surroundings. So I absolutely could have done this on a lighter tone of paper. It's not impossible. Just really makes the painting process very enjoyable to have a dark paper with something like this. When there is a lot of darkness in the image, it just makes sense sometimes to start from the dark surface. And you can really see why in this case, how vibrant these yellows and oranges are starting to look already. So the back windows I've done with BE6 so far. They're quite dark so far, but I will lighten them up a little bit, like you can see here, just overlaying some of the lighter orange tones. So one of the brighter yellows now. This is extremely vibrant, additional 12 from Unison. And it's a very nice little piece of the top of a pastel. So it's got a nice broken edge to it here, and I can use that to my advantage. Just trying to get a little bit more precision with my marks. Again, I'm not worried if it looks really neat and tidy at this stage. A lot can be done later on to help the neatness of the edges of everything. So an even lighter yellow, this is yellow 4 from Unison. And like I said earlier, as we come down in around the candle itself, we get a lot lighter yellows towards the bottom. And you can see here I'm just struggling to find a little edge on the pastel. I'm definitely finding it tricky to get any sense of the straight lines and the crisp edges all around the shape of this lantern. But as I know from previous experience, it's just not necessary at this stage that everything's nice and neat. And I keep turning the pastel, trying to find a little edge that will give me a nice straight mark. Just look at how bright this particular yellow looks. Yellow 4. And so I'm aiming that in particular down towards the bottom. The candlelight down there is affecting everything. We also get some little parts of that shining up around the top of the lantern too. But in general, it's just a little bit less bright up around the inside ceiling of the lantern. So this is A12 again. So quite a few different yellows used. Some are really vibrant yellow, or yellow with a bit more white mixed in. So I've got a little tiny shard here of the yellow 4, and I would describe that as yellow with a bit more white mixed in. So like a very vibrant yellow tint. And we go right through the yellows into the oranges. So a really lovely selection of vibrant yellows used in this. So later on, when I add the actual door in front of this, it's going to cut through some of those edges and clean up my yellow sections. So I can use the darker colours of the metal of the lantern to tidy up a lot of this yellow that I'm adding now. So a very tricky section, or so I thought it would be later on, will be to add those little ornate designs, the little metal designs all over the lantern. So down the front here, we get a little hint of some of the ones off around the sides of the lantern. And then of course that top, the little hat on top of the lantern there, it's got a really intricate design that we get all of the warm light shining out of. And of course that's half the beauty of these little lanterns. The more little patterns you get on there, the more interesting the light that comes from the lantern is. And sometimes it shines all of these lovely patterns on your wall. So of course I wanted to include a bit of that. I wanted to paint a lantern that had some of that going on, but it certainly added some tricky parts for me. So this is NE1. It looks rather bright on screen here just because of the contrast between that and the surrounding blacks. But this is a darker orange brown, and I'm adding that in underneath the little cap at the top here, because of course that's another place that we get a lot of orange and yellow glowing. And then this is my Terry Ludwig N030. This actually becomes the main colour that I use on a lot of the outside of the lantern. Now, if you don't have any Terry Ludwigs, please don't panic. There are many other brands and other substituted colours you could use here. So just for an example, if you've got lots of unisons, perhaps you've got something similar to A38 or A39. And those are just two examples of two other colours that would work in place of that particular Terry Ludwig. So there's really no right or wrong with the colour choices here. As long as you choose something that is similar, it will absolutely work just as well. So let's get some of the top of the lantern blocked in, just like I did with the base. Let's get the lid on. And this is Terry Ludwig Green 620. So these parts that are just disappearing off around the sides, they're just a little bit darker than the front panels. And when I look at the metal on the front, on the outside of the lantern, I do get a little hint of green in some places. It's one of those things that you can pick out quite a lot of colours on the outside of the lantern. And I'm basically just going with something reasonably dark as a base coat. So I can come back in, add some extra little bits of glowing warmth on certain surfaces. But to begin with, I'm just coming in with something that I can treat as the base layer. I can either darken or lighten this, add some shading, add some glowing extra colours. But for now, it's just a base layer. And you can start to see what's happening there, because even though it's quite dark, what I'm adding on the outside of the lantern, it still shows up because of how dark the surroundings are. So it's all to do with the contrast. So this is yellow 15. And I did put a good amount of effort at the beginning into drawing this little section out. And now, as you can see, I'm kind of dotting this bright pigment all over the top of it, and I'm kind of losing my sketch lines a little bit. And what I'm painting in here are the negative areas, so I'm not trying to paint the metal here, I'm trying to paint the light that's shining through the metal. And I can still get a sense of my sketch here, so it's not the end of the world if I lose some of the lines. Just adding this bright colour that's going to shine through the metal parts, that's enough to guide me later on when I come in to add the actual metal. And you'll see later that I do use some pastel pencil to do that. This little area in particular was really intricate. But my sketch lines really guide me here when trying to add these little blobs of light. And then you can still kind of get a sense of the shapes there that will be the metal on top of that. So a lot of the work right now being done with the light and with the yellows and the oranges. And this is BE6. Hopefully, as we progress through the demo, you start becoming a bit more familiar with the colours that I'm using. It's not a huge palette, reasonably limited number of colours to identify in this. But of course, as always, in the footage, sometimes they look a little bit different as I progress. Perhaps they get a bit dirty by my dirty fingertips. And of course, some of them are extremely small. So this little tiny shard just cracked off the side of a piece of yellow 4 unison. And what a useful little shard it was. So every little piece of pastel becomes useful at some point. Keep all of those little crumbs, every little shard. If you drop a box of pastels, keep hold of every single little shard that you create. This is NE1. You can see now, comparing it to the brighter yellow oranges, that it's a little bit darker. But even at this stage, with all I've done and as rough as it is, it already just starts to glow a little bit. And I think a bit of that is due to the dark coloured paper. We get such a lovely contrast between the brightest colours and the rich darkness of the paper. So again, that little tiny shard coming in useful. Sometimes the smaller the piece, the easier it is to control and get some precision with your mark. Of course, there is the problem of actually holding the piece of pastel, which can be tricky sometimes. But such a tiny piece of pigment to have such an enormous impact in its colour. And I absolutely did drop it a few times. It's a little bit tricky to keep hold of, but it was worth the effort. It was very useful. So if you're using a fresher pastel stick for this, don't be afraid to break it in half. You'll find that you then have 2 half pastel sticks, both with one end that has very nice sharp edges for you to use. So don't be afraid to break the odd pastel stick. You don't have to break them all as soon as you buy them and take them out of the box. Just break them as and when you need a sharp edge. So I'm just taking some moments there to have a bit of a think and to come back in and start working on the little tea light candle. And I wasn't too sure what colour to go for the actual tea light. I've tried a little bit of M560 there, and this is NE1. I know that the inside of the tea light, where we get the molten wax, that's really glowing extremely bright. And for that, I've got A7 from Unison. Now this still isn't pure white. It looks pure white on screen here just because of the contrast. But this still has a little hint of yellow in it, so it's not as cold as pure white. Quite often my brightest value will be something that's just a little bit off white. And if I want warmth in my whites, then it makes sense to use a lighter tint like this. Another favourite would be Grey 27 from the Unison range. So again, if you don't have these exact colours, maybe there's something else that fits the description. So you basically want to avoid pure white as much as possible. There is a place for it, but quite often, even if I'm using something really close to pure white, it will have a little tint of something about it. And quite often it's tinted with something yellowish because I'm wanting to warm up the white area, not have it look quite so cold and stark. So in this area we get a lot of the brighter yellow value just in and around the tea light. This is where the brightest light source is, and I really want to capture that effect in the painting. So first little bit of pastel pencil. This is a reasonably dark brown. And I'll only use 2 different pastel pencils in this piece. There will be that darker brown colour and a black pastel pencil as well. And I'm using a Dutch brand of pencil there called Bruinzeel. Again, not important that you've got the same brand of pencil as me. Any darker brown and any black will work. So another bit of any one, just going over those back windows. I've made them pretty dark to begin with using BE6. Now I'm just toning them down a little bit because we're seeing them through the front windows. We're getting a lot of glare from the candlelight on them. But at the same time, it is the dark surface, the dark stone that we're seeing just to the right and to the left of the lantern. That's what we're also seeing through those back windows, of course. So this is grey 24, just another lighter yellow tint. And again, even that looks pretty white on screen, but it's not. It does have a bit of a yellow tint to it. And my absolute brightest value in this piece, which you can see going on now, is that A7, so additional 7 from Unison. So it really helps to get the light source in. That is where all of the colour and all of the glow is radiating out from. So that's a good bit of work done inside the lantern. That's what I wanted, to get a lot of the glowing colours inside, to add the actual light source, that little tea light. And now I can start to think about the metal outside parts of the lantern, and of course they need to be a good bit darker. And as I said earlier, I'm going to use the Terry Ludwig N030 for a lot of the outer frame. And again, this is just a base coat, so I usually want to come in a little bit darker. I can darken some areas, I can go lighter, I can add some little glowing parts to the framework. But this colour is a pretty good base colour for the whole frame. And just as we're talking about breaking pastels earlier, there is a broken Terry Ludwig, all for the sake of some straight edges. So now I've got 2 halves to that pastel, and both of them have corners and sharp edges. Of course, they're going to get worn down too, but between those 2 pieces, I have lots to work with now. And this really is a tricky part of the process, because I'm trying to add the framework over the top of the lovely glowing inside of the lantern. And I kind of want to use this outer part of the frame to neaten up everything that I've done on the inside of the lantern. So I need a bit of a steady hand and a few sharp edges on my pastel sticks. But this part of the process was also really nice to do, because bit by bit now we start to set those glowing colours inside the lantern, start to cut through some of the edges here, just like that. And of course I can make use of the black tone of paper to help me out a little bit with some of the joins on this framework, because you can see on the corner here we get a darker line, so it's almost like the metal of the lantern is a little bit tarnished around the edges. And you can see there that I was just able to leave a little bit of black showing down the corner of that. Now over here was particularly difficult. Those outer edges were really tricky to try and get a nice straight line. If I mess up here though, it's not the end of the world either, because I can neaten it up from the background colours. There's a certain amount of leeway with soft pastel where you can layer it up. The paper will accept much more than just one layer of colour. But it goes reasonably well, and I managed to cut through those bright yellows without making too much of a mess. So if you're working along, just depending on how comfortable you feel with your pastel sticks, feel free to also pick up some pastel pencils along the way if you're more comfortable using those. But I do encourage you to try some of this out with soft pastel sticks in order to improve your accuracy using the soft sticks. Well, you've got to attempt some things like this. And there's a little bit of frustration along the way. It's taken me many years of working with soft pastel to get a really good feel for them. But I promise it does come with time. But you could absolutely pick up a bit of extra pastel pencil along the way in this one. Just do what you're comfortable with. So the front door, and you can see here just cutting down through those overlapping oranges and yellows just to make that front metal door more solid. So it's still that same Terry Ludwig N030, looking for sharp edges, especially in the places where I've got to cut right through the middle of my lovely yellows and oranges. And then this delicate little bar that comes down the center of the door. searching for edges, constantly turning the pastel, because of course you find an edge and then you make a mark using it and the edge goes a bit blunt, so you're constantly turning the pastel stick. But just look at how that starts to come together already, just with the general shapes there blocked in. And now we can start to think about the smaller details that I can see on the framework, for example. I've picked up my black hard pastel stick again, the new pastel. And I'm starting to look for all of these little places where the metal overlaps another part, or we get a dark shadow running along the base, like here. So the main shapes are there. And now I can start to refine and look for the little details. Just darkening down this edge of the lantern. The black is quite useful for a little bit of shading just around the edges. And of course, as well as the hard black new pastel stick, I've got my pastel pencils as well. So again, this is the brown. And in a moment, you'll also see the black pastel pencil come into play. So you can see here, I'm just shading little parts. Here I'm just darkening the main shadow underneath the lantern. I really love within a still life when you get the object sitting out over the edge of whatever surface it's on. Such a common trick used by the old masters. I've seen it used in so many still lifes. And it really just adds an extra sense of the 3D to the painting. Of course, paintings are like fancy optical illusions. We're using tonal value and colour to make a 2D thing look like it's 3D. And of course, creating a lovely dark shadow underneath and just having that edge of the lantern jutting out over the shelf. That's just another way to enhance the optical illusion. So it's a good trick to keep in mind if you like working on still life. Something protruding out over the edge of the surface. That has been tried and tested for centuries. And of course, there are many different ways to paint things as well. So the stage that I'm at here now, I actually quite like that. There's a possibility that you could leave it at this, especially if the lantern was part of a bigger scene. So the level of detail that you choose to go into is very much part of your style. That's one of the decisions that you can make along the way. And then you'll have artists who work to the very, very finest details, getting everything photorealistically correct. So there's no right or wrong with that. It's just your personal style, your choice. And the same can be said for your color choices. Another artist might paint this with an entirely different palette. There are so many ways to approach one image, and a lot of the time, the decisions that we make are part of what makes us recognizable as an artist. And there are quite a few artists that I can think of that I just have to see a glimpse of the colours that they've chosen. If I just see their colour palette, I'll know exactly who it is right away. So here is the black pencil because I am going to work on and get this to a higher level of detail. It already resembles the object. Now I want to enhance the realism even further. And you can see there I can use the black pencil just to neaten up some of the edges. I'm creating some of those little strips of metal that overlap other pieces of metal. And as I said earlier, there's like a little bit of tarnish to the metal lantern. And that seems to happen mostly around the edges of things, which is handy for me because it means that I can use that darker pastel pencil to neaten up the edges and at the same time give a little hint of the tarnished edges as well. So BE12 here. Just adding some of those glowing bits of reflected light. These are on the underside of the top ledge here. And so it's catching a bit more of the light from inside the lantern. So again, corners and edges. All the time just keeping an eye on the overall perspective of things. I mean, I'm usually happy with my sketch before I transfer it, so I'm pretty sure that I've got the perspectives and things like that pretty well. But of course, I've gone over my sketch lines quite a lot, and so I've still got to think about those things at this stage just to make sure that nothing goes a bit off. So little tarnished corners and edges. And some extra bright little slithers of light, just catching this down facing edge. And I've used my little yellow shard for that, and then just brightening it another little bit using grey 24. So as I progress and I start to add more and more detail, I get a little bit more precise. I'm a little bit more delicate with the marks that I'm making now, and I'm coming back in sometimes with the pastel pencils to neaten and shape. So I've just noticed I'm a little bit off with how far out those two sides protrude into the background. That's why I just added a little bit more length there. And then I can shape it using the background colours. So that's better for this top little corner. I'm just shaping that really using a bit of extra darkness in the background. I darkened my original photo reference quite a lot for this little demo. I really wanted the glow of the lantern to be the brightest thing and to not have too much background there to distract us. So it's mostly black up above the lantern especially. So again, just looking for all of those nice little overlaps on the strips of metal. And the slightly tarnished edge of a corner here. Not the straightest line, but not bad either. And you can see how a bit of wobbliness in my lines at this stage is absolutely fine. Just having the precise ruled lines at the start is enough to keep it under control. I don't need to rule anything at this stage. If it's a little bit wonky, it's not the end of the world. And just look at the lantern. I mean, the lantern actually is a little bit wonky. It's not the highest quality item ever made. So a little bit of a wobble in my lines here and there is no bad thing. So I can keep refining a little bit with the black pencil. And then I'm going to go back to working a little bit again on the inside of the lantern, because as much as I've got the main shapes and colours in there, there's still a little bit of detail to add and a little bit of adjustment to do on the values inside the lantern. So let's start to have a look at some of the details on the inside of the lantern. Of course, I'm going to make use of that tiny little shard of yellow 4. And here we have yellow 14. You can see the unusual shape of this piece of pastel. I think it's a piece that was previously dropped on the floor, and it has left me with this very nice flat on one side piece that makes very nice detailed marks. And now I'm just going to lighten these side windows that we can see through to the back of the lantern. And that's BE12. But I can also use the brown pastel pencil again here, just to help neaten some of these edges. So this is where the pastel pencils start to become really useful. I've gone about as far as I can get with the details using the sticks in some areas. I can really crisp up an edge using the sharp point of the pencil. But I'm only using 2 dark coloured pencils here. I'm not trying to use any bright oranges or yellow colours. As you can see, I am persevering with the soft pastel sticks when it comes to my lighter colours. And that's simply because I won't get the same strength of colour, the same opacity of colour as I get from the soft sticks. And where that matters the most is in my lighter coloured values in this piece. These light colours have to show up against a lot of darkness, and you can see how good the soft pastel sticks are for that. Unfortunately, you just don't get the same strength of colour from the pencils, at least not when you're combining the two. If I were to do this piece entirely with pastel pencil, I think I would probably do okay to get the bright colours, but it's more when you're trying to layer up the different pigments. The pencils are not so great in the lighter colours at going over the top of other pigment like this. Whereas you can see that my soft pastel sticks in the lighter colours, they just cut through whatever dark pigment is already on the paper. So instead, I make use of darker coloured pencils here because I can add a little bit too much of my lighter colour using the sticks, like you can see there, and then I'm just taking it away using the darker colour. So I can add those lighter colours and then edit with the sharp point of the pencils in the darker colours. So that's a little bit more refining to edges. Let's get another piece of broken pastel here though. That was grey 24, and I now have two little pieces of grey 24. I just want to brighten some of the reflected light inside down closest to the candlelight. So these bottom sections of the panels, just adding that over the top of my lightest yellows. And a little bit more glare on the glass closest to the flame. So this is A12, that incredibly vibrant yellow. And my trusty little shard of yellow 4 again. I think this tiny piece of pastel actually made this painting possible. And just attempting some tiny little edges to some of the window frames. And small little details like that where we get the overlap of two panels of metal where they don't quite meet as a neat corner. So let's punch some holes in the metal on the top of the lantern. Tiny piece of yellow. I can still vaguely see my outlines for these, more or less just to help me in the placement of the shapes. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect because of course I can use the darker coloured pencil to come in and shape all of this. So I just try to get them as close as possible. And when I look at the photo reference, I can actually see like a little outline to these shapes. Again, it's the slightly tarnished metal. So that's good. That makes that a lot easier because I can literally add a little bit of a dark outline like this. But just look at how vibrantly the yellow colour goes on top of this darker pigment. If I had picked up a yellow pastel pencil there, it would never have shown up as strongly as this. So that's why there are times when I'm really persevering with a tiny shard of pastel because of the strength of the colour. So that's a few light holes punched through the top of the lantern. Then we've got this lovely little glowing cap. So let's have a look at the ornate cut out part of the lantern up here. I've picked up the brown pastel pencil here. And I can pretty much see the vague shapes of it here. You can use that as a guide and just keep a good close eye on the reference image at the same time. Now I'm really cutting through the oranges and yellows here. And I just take my time, work my way right over this little area of pattern. So I was really pleased with how that top section turned out. Wasn't as difficult as it looks. Just be sure to get the lighter glowing colours in there first. And then you're kind of cutting your way through that with the pattern. So some other areas of smaller detail, we've got the latch over here on the right side of the door. And we've also got some hinges on the far left because the door goes right around the corner. So it's this whole front left corner of the lantern that opens. And then on this little section here though, next to the latch, we get quite a lot of light just leaking out from the lantern. So I've got my BE12 here, and that's going right over that section of metal that's on the outside of the lantern. Just like down here on this upwards facing surface, we get a bit of light leaking out, making that glow an orange colour. So that's the part that I'm at now, adding some of that extra bit of glow around the lantern. So there are certain parts on the outside where we get some light just leaking out from the inside. This is BE11. You can see that it's slightly more vibrant than the previous one. So I'm really starting to look at some of the glowing reflected light now. So where is it leaking out through the seams in the metal? Like here where these two bits overlap, and then we get this little glowing edge where the light is obviously filtering out through the two pieces of metal that they're not completely flush here, so it's an imperfection in the lantern that is allowing this little bit of reflected light, and that just makes it all the better to paint, really. So you can see that that darker Terry Ludwig colour was a great base for the outer metal panels of the lantern. But now I can start to look at each panel and add colour. So that's pretty much what I'm doing for the next few minutes here. Just looking at all of my edges and doing a bit of neatening up. So at this stage, I just lost a little bit of footage there. And really, the only thing that I've done is you can see that I've marked in with a black pastel pencil the little latch that comes down on the front of the door there, just to the right. So I've marked in that little latch ready for a bit more colour and a couple of little dots of highlight on it. And this is really the fun stages of any painting. You've got the basis of it there and it's starting to look good, and you can really look around and start to make those little adjustments. So I'm just adding an extra bit of a glow coming through these little holes at the top. But the next intricate thing that I've got to work on now will be the next patterns that I see coming down the front of the lantern, and then also off to the two sides we can just see a little hint of the shapes on the other windows. So still a bit to do, but we are certainly getting there now. So just continuing to look right across all of the little panels that are outward facing. Are there any more areas where it's glowing? Just catching a bit of the light from the inside. And I'm using a really light touch here when I just want to add a little hint of colour over the top of another colour. I'm going as lightly as I can and then just very gently mix or blend that colour into the one underneath. But it's a very light touch. In fact, it's a very light touch a lot of the time. I'm not leaning too heavily. Sometimes if I want to add a very definite bright mark somewhere, then yes, I'm leaning a little bit heavier. But it's a light touch most of the time, especially when I'm just trying to add a little skiffle of the colour over the top of another. So reflected light, that's one time that I'm usually using quite a light touch. And then I can even use my brown pencil to kind of blend that layer of orange colour in a little bit. You can see there I'm kind of using that to mix the orange in a little bit. So now it's time to have a look at some of the more intricate little details on these little bits of metal on the outside of the lantern. So I've picked up yellow 15, and the parts that we can see through the lantern, we're seeing the backs of these bits of metal, and of course it's from the inside light of the lantern. So these sections are the lighter colours. But then of course the metal on the front in the centre of the door, that's going to be the darker colours again because it's on the outside of the lantern and we're seeing the front of it on the outside. So I just do my best to get the general shape of it using the bigger yellow 15. And then I can shape all of that with the brown pastel pencil. So we're not seeing that much of it over here because of course it's on the outside of the lantern. We're just seeing the back of it. And then similar on the other side of the lantern, we can see a little bit of the back of the one over on the left side too. So I really hope that you're enjoying this one if you're working along with me. Always remember you can take this at your own pace. Maybe you want to pause as we go and work a little bit without the footage moving ahead. Of course, that's the nice thing about a video tutorial. You can still take it at your own pace. So I'm just using that brown pencil like before, just blending the orange colour in a little bit more. Then I've got a little bit more work to do around the latch on the door. The door is not actually closed properly, so it's not latched in on the other side. It's hanging open just a little bit. And then we've also got the hinges over to the far left here. So I've just picked up my general dark metal colour, which is the Terry Ludwig N030. Just blocked in the shapes of the hinges over there. And then we've got the little bar latch and the holder that's attached on the other side here. So I haven't added that yet. That's just what I'm going to do now using my black pencil. And just strengthening up the shape of that little bar with the bend in the middle. And I'm just doing all of that initially with the black, and then I can add a little bit of highlight in a couple of places because you can see that that little metal bar is actually catching the light. And again, using the brown pencil just to soften that orange tone in a little bit. So just using the pencil to help blend that colour in a little bit and continue some of the warmth on down there as well. So it's really like a little bit of the warmth is leaking out from inside the lantern to some of these outward facing surfaces. And you've got to recognize this little piece of pastel by now, yellow 4. How useful is that? I'm able to add these little bits of highlight with a decent amount of precision. But even if not, it doesn't really matter because you can always shape it from the other side like I'm doing here. So although this isn't the most Christmassy demo I've done, last year I was working on some lovely shiny Christmas baubles hanging on a tree, being lit by some of the little lights. And I did a lovely still life of some mulled wine as well. So quite Christmassy themes last year. This year I just fancied something different, and we've hit quite a cold spell of weather here in the south of Spain. You would think that because I live in the south of Spain that we wouldn't really get winter, but we absolutely do. And I live quite high up in some mountains. I'm about 1,000 meters above sea level here, so it's not the tallest mountains, but it's certainly pretty high up to live, and it definitely gets more of the chill in the air. And of course, being high up in a mountain, some days we just don't come out of the clouds. So at this time of year, I absolutely love to get the fire lit. I love the glow of little lights in the room. Get the big lights turned off. Get the fire lit, get some twinkly things going. And I have quite a few little lanterns like this that I just love to light in the evenings. Partly for the extra heat, but mostly for the comforting glow that they give off. And I hadn't really painted something like this before, but it was extremely satisfying to work on because as soon as you start coming in on top of the black surface that we're working on, as soon as you start to add some of those oranges and yellows, it really starts to feel like warmth. And I've got to say, it was quite nice at this time of the year to have something so warm on my easel. So I hope that if you are somewhere wintry at the minute, that this will bring a little bit of warmth to your studio or wherever you make your art. So let's just add a few little hints of the hinges here. A little bit of orange reflecting on the edges of the hinges. And while we're doing little tiny bits of highlight, let's have a look at this little bit here, just on the bottom of that little holder, and coming around tiny little edge of the bar, the little bend on the bar. So a little dot and a little dash here and there, being really sparing with those brightest bits of highlight. And this is my little piece of broken grey 24 from earlier. So one of the final things I've got to do really on the lantern is this front design. We can see more of this one than on the left and right ones. And of course this one needs to be darker in value because it's on the outside of the lantern. We're seeing the outside facing face of this little ornate design. So I'm just trying to get a few more of the holes that I can see, and a little bit of extra glare on the back window, but also having a look at some of the colours that are shining through the holes here. So a bit like that section at the top of the lantern where I added all of the glowing light coming through, and then used the brown pastel pencil to shape the actual metal in front of that. That's exactly what I'm going to do here. It's just very delicately trying to catch a little inside edge of the metal. But now let's have a look at this design on the front of the lantern. So surprisingly, it's not that difficult to come back in like this over the top of those colours. I can still pretty much see the general shapes of this little pattern. And because I sketched this out by hand, I have studied this little section now. And that helps me when it comes to this part because I've already kind of figured out what direction the little swirly bits go in. I kind of know what's going on. I've already analysed this whole little pattern when I was sketching it out. And I can kind of see the dark shadows, the shapes that I need to create here. I can also use the light shapes, so where the light has to shine through, those negative spaces, I can really make use of those to direct my lines. But I get the main shape of it kind of blocked in now using the brown pencil. And then of course, because we're seeing this one from the outside, it sits over the top of the crisscrossed bars on the door. And we get a little bit of detail on the front of this one as well. So let's get just the shape of it blocked in and then think about some of the details on the front of it after that. So I'm just strengthening up some of the light shining through these little holes. And then I'll go back to the pastel pencil and add a little bit of detail down the front of this. So just a few final touches, but I'm pretty happy with the level of detail and intricacy that I've got here on those shapes. And then here I'm just adding the hinges, so cutting through part of my orange line. So it's all those little details that just finish it off, really. And I really slow my whole process down when it comes to bits like this. You can get so much work, or so it seems, you can get so much done when you're blocking things in. You're adding big chunks of colour, and things come together very quickly at that stage. But now I'm really slowing my process down, looking for all those little finishing details that just add an extra bit of realism. So just one extra little bit of light to punch through. I missed this one up on the top of the lantern. We can't see very much of it because it's a way off around the corner, but we do see a little bit. Just a couple of little dots is enough to give the impression of it. And from this point really, I'm just adding a few extra finishing touches to the lantern. And then to finish off this little demo, I'm going to add a few of the fern leaves coming in from the left side. I said that I wanted to leave the background of this one pretty simple, and I'm really not going to do much more to the background wall or the ledge that the lantern is sitting on. Of course, if you choose, you could work a little bit more into the texture of those areas and really try to render the light and shade as we see it across the surface of the stone. But I decided to just leave our focus mainly on the lantern itself and not worry too much about the background. But I did like the hint of leaves coming in, just slightly overlapping the lantern at the bottom left corner. So that is one final area that I'll work on. And I'm just having a last look at the background here as well. But really not going to do too much extra. You can see me play with the idea there for a moment of going into a bit more texture on the background. But I decided against it. I feel like it didn't really need that. So this green tone is making quite a late appearance in the painting. This is Yellow Green Earth 18. And just like I've overlaid some of the orange tones on the outside of the lantern, I also decided to overlay a little bit of this slightly lighter green. I said somewhere near the start that I could see quite a lot of green on the cooler parts of the outside of the lantern. And so I'm just adding a little bit of texture and bringing in a bit of this green over the surface of the lantern in the places where we're not reaching the real warm light. So this is how you can play with your colours. There may not actually be an awful lot of actual green on the surface of the lantern, but you can take a little bit of artistic license sometimes and just push a colour in a certain direction if you want. I've said it many times, but the main important thing to get right is your tonal value. So how light or dark the area should be. That will be the main thing that makes it successful. Beyond that, your color choices, you've got a broad variety of choices available that will all work. But this has been a really interesting study on tonal value actually, because just look how dark we've made the white lantern. And that's just all to do with the lighting. What is the light doing to that white coloured lantern? So just a few finishing touches on the lantern, and then I will move on to the bottom left corner and we'll get a few, well, a hint of a few fern leaves coming in. So let's move on now and get the background complete. And the first thing I'm doing here is with the black harder pastel stick. Just strengthen up a couple of dark shadows in underneath the lantern around this bottom ledge. And again, I don't want to spend forever on the fern leaves. I just liked that little hint of them coming in, bringing a little bit more of the green colour that I decided to include on the lantern. These will kind of tie in a little bit of greenery, which I thought looked really nice in the reference image. So I'm just going to darken down around and in between the fern leaves. Next, I've got a dark green from Terry Ludwig. This is G520. Again, if you haven't got Terry Ludwig pastels, a different type of dark green will absolutely do. And I'm going to use that green for the majority of the blocking in of the fern leaves. You can see down the center of this one that comes down to the very bottom of the picture, we've got a lot of dark shadow over the left side of that. So I'm really just going to pick out some of the colour on this right side. Obviously that's bending inwards towards the lantern, picking up a bit of the light of the lantern. I think that's why I liked the fern leaves involved, because again it gives us something else to have the glowing light reflecting off rather than just the lantern on its own. I feel like these give us a little bit more of the effects that the lantern is having in the room. But it wasn't my intention to go into great detail on the greenery over here. As we come out from the centre of the picture, I want to get a bit less detailed. Keep all of that nice detail right in the middle, where the light source is coming from. Really draw our eyes to the candlelight. And if I can keep out here pretty dark and not too detailed, it shouldn't distract from the main focus too much. So another green, this time just slightly lighter. This is G650. Again, a Terry Ludwig. So you can see it's just a little bit lighter. And I can start to pick out just a little bit of highlight so that they don't look quite so flat. And then final green choice, which is a really yellow green. This is Yellow Green Earth 11 from Unison. And of course, we can see a lot of that warmth coming from the lantern, just catching some of the closest bits of fern. But apart from that, I am not going to go into too much detail over here. I just wanted a little hint of it over in the bottom corner. But I had so much fun working on this little demo. I hope you've had fun too, whether you're just watching along or whether you took the plunge and worked along with me. If you do happen to work along with me and you post this anywhere online, please do tag me. I would love to see. I always love to see the different renditions from different artists who've worked along with my tutorials. It's amazing to see the variety of work that can come from the tutorials. And also, if you are an artist on Instagram, I am happy to follow people back. I recently lost my Instagram. I got hacked over there, so I'm starting afresh on Instagram this year. So leave me a comment below and let me know your Instagram handle. I'll happily go and follow you back. But final couple of touches here, and then we are done. So there we have it, a lovely little glowing candlelit lantern that was so satisfying to see just looming out of the darkness gradually. And I hope that you really enjoyed if you worked along with me and that you've got yourself your own little version of this painting now. Again, a huge thank you to all of you who have subscribed to me here on YouTube. It really helps me to keep making these videos. And I hope that I'll find time again in the near future to make another one of these little real-time demos for free. But of course, what actually funds most of my video making is the support I gain over on Patreon. So I'll add links in the description below. If you'd like more real-time demos like this, then do come and check out my full library over there. And if you can't afford to come and support me there right now, the best thing you can do for free is to hit that subscribe button, leave me a comment here, like the video. All of these things are free and I appreciate your support so much. So thank you very much for watching this. And until next time, happy pasteling.